Hey, vinyl community. Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records, and I've had a idea in my cobwebs of my brain for a while of wanting to do a series about bluegrass, and I've put off trying to create it, write some stuff down and things like that, and actually doing it. And today I said, what the heck? I'm going to wing it a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with it. So this is, I am no means expert, but I do know right much about bluegrass. So I want to offer my thoughts and opinions about bluegrass, what it is, how we might define it, and some examples of it in a series here that I'm going to do on bluegrass. What is it? So the first segment is going to be about the origins of bluegrass and strictly speaking bluegrass, and then we'll look at broadly speaking in another installment. So first of all, bluegrass is a genre of music recognized today as being created by one man, but that may be an oversimplification. Of course, Bill Monroe, and this is just an album I pulled by Bill Monroe, nothing definitive about this LP, because when this music was getting started, it was 78s and then 45s that you would see, not albums. But Bill Monroe is considered the father of bluegrass. Um, but he did not create it in a vacuum. He did not create it all by himself. But he was the architect. And there's no denying that, and you can't really argue any other way. I don't believe about it. But Bill Monroe came out of Western Kentucky, not the mountains of East Kentucky, but Western Kentucky, and emerged as a duet singer. And I've got a series about the brother acts that includes one on Charlie and Bill Monroe, the Monroe brothers. And it came out in the 1930s, and when he and his brother broke up, Bill went on to form his own bands and was experimenting with different things in the late 30s into the 1940s, different combinations of musicians, different sounds. And Bill was influenced by lots of different music. He was influenced by the fiddle tunes and old time music, the brother duos, which he was a part of that movement, and the blues. From a very young age, he was influenced by the blues. He lived in the greater Chicago area during his young adulthood for several years, so he was also influenced by swing and big band and jazz. So he was exposed to all that sort of stuff. And he kind of just keeps looking for what is just right for him to come up with his own band sound. And in 1945, he picked up in quick succession two musicians that would be key to that. Uh, a lead singer and rhythm guitarist named Lester Flatt, and a banjo player named Earl Scruggs. Flatt from Eastern Tennessee, and Scruggs from the area around Shelby, North Carolina, in the foothills. And in North Carolina's Piedmont area, there was a style of banjo playing that wasn't the claw hammer or frailing style that is most dominant. We would hear most often, and in which which Bill's bands had been utilizing. Uh, but there were people that were playing two-finger rolls and three-finger rolls. Different regions of the country, uh, even within states and just in general areas, uh, you would have different styles. And this two and three finger roll style, Snuffy Jenkins, for instance, from not far from where Earl Scruggs lived, was playing in that style, and there were some others as well, less well known, Snuffy Jenkins being the most well known of those. Earl, as a young boy, kept working with that, and he developed his own syncopated three-finger roll, which would become known as Scruggs style. That's not to say that Earl, again, just like Bill didn't invent bluegrass in a vacuum, Earl didn't invent this banjo picking style in a vacuum. He built upon what others had done previously and came up with this. So this playing style was just something that the general public had not heard. And when he joined Bill Monroe's band in 1945 and first appeared on the Grand Ole Opry, it blew people away because it was this fast, energetic style, just firing note after note, just blew people away. And people had never heard this before. So it really electrified the crowd, and Bill was smart enough to realize, hey, this is a sound I want to incorporate, into my style. This works, So that's why he got Earl in the band. And Lester was a great lead singer, and he developed what, again, he didn't invent it probably, but you heard it constantly from him, what's called the flat run or the G run, because things were so fast. He would finish up songs using that G run, or he would keep from getting behind with that G run. So now you've got the Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys playing this music. Nobody else was playing this. There were old time musicians on the Grand Ole Opry and on radio stations and things like that. There were fiddlers out there playing old time music and Western swing and things like that. But there was no band with this particular sound. So with the help of Flat, Scruggs, and fiddlers like Chubby Wise, Kenny Baker, Bill created his sound. And while all this was going on, they were playing radio shows, the Grand Ole Opry for one, but also playing on other radio stations during the week, and they were touring regionally. You had to be close enough where you could get back to, if you were on the Grand Ole Opry, get back to Nashville on Saturday night to be there. So it was kind of regional touring. And Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys were extremely popular, especially this lineup that included Flat and Scruggs. There were some boys in Virginia at a radio station in Bristol that were listening, and they were absorbing what they were hearing from Bill Monroe, and they were from the mountains of Virginia, and it were two brothers, Carter and Ralph, the Stanley brothers. And more, their radio show in Bristol and in other radio stations, the bands would travel from one station to another, playing. More and more, they were learning these Bill Monroe songs after hearing them on the radio and incorporating them into their act. So much so, they were pretty much a cover band, a Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys cover band. In fact, they would listen to a song on Saturday night. They would figure it out. Somebody would write down the lyrics. They would, figure out the melody and everything, and they would get it figured out. And they were playing it on their radio show the next week. And they were recording stuff. Bill would be premiering on the Grand Ole Opry. Stanley Brothers recorded it and put it out before Bill Monroe could record it and put it out. So early on, there was a lot of resentment by Bill Monroe. Bill Monroe felt his style, we're calling it a style now, was being ripped off by the Stanley Brothers. And it was, but that's what bands do. They hear something that's popular and they try to emulate it. And so early on, Stanley Brothers were kind of a cover band for Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. And then in 1948, Lester and Earl leave the band. Now, this was a huge controversy in the annals of bluegrass history. Lester and Earl said that they did not uh, plan this in advance. Other people say, well, they heard them talking about it. Well, I imagine they probably did talk about it. Hey, we ought to form our own band and stuff. One of the things was Bill hated handling the money. And they were making about $60 a week, which wasn't bad, except for the fact that they were working their tails off. Night after night on the road to dates, and then rushing back to record, rushing back to play the Grand Ole Opry, and there was no rest for the weary. And Earl was in charge of the money. Why? He's the only one that had a high school diploma. And he was in charge of keeping the money, counting it at the end of the night, getting it, put up, put away, and then when they get back to Nashville at the end of the week, turn the money over. This is how much we took in this way. He was seeing, $60 seemed like a lot to begin with a week, but then he was seeing how much money they were actually bringing in, and he said, I'm working my tail off. I'm doing all this work. I'm handling the books, yet I'm making a pittance of what Bill's making. Now, they weren't getting rich doing this, but these were difficult times, and they were making good money. They were making better money than they could at working at an oil refinery or textile mill. Earl had been working at a textile mill before this to take care of his mother. So Earl leaves the band. Another aspect of this, Bill kept all the songwriting credits. Anything the band did, it was copyrighted into his name, regardless of how much of a role he played in writing it. And oftentimes, and many times, he didn't even give the primary creator any songwriting credit, even half credit or anything. And there was a particular breakdown, banjo breakdown, that Earl felt like he wrote. And Bill, they recorded it, Bill took all the copyright credit. Now, he didn't lead the band over that. And, I'm speculating here on how much of this played a factor in it. But I know this, a year or two later, after Earl and Lester formed their own band, Earl wrote another banjo breakdown. Just changed one thing, the chords in the song, the chord structure of the song. He just changed it very slightly and copyrighted in his name, as was his right. And that was Foggy Mountain Breakdown. So, he kind of got his little revenge there, I guess, would be. There would be a contentious relationship for years and years between Bill Monroe and Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. Somewhat resolved toward the end of their lives, but still pretty darn contentious, to the point where Flatt and Scruggs couldn't play on the Grand Ole Opry because Bill used his influence to keep them off for several years before they finally were able to, their popularity had grown to the point where they had to get in. So that's, they formed Flatt and Scruggs and the Foggy Mountain Boys. All right. There's a typical look at the band right there. Just remember, all these albums are reissues, so you don't know, oftentimes, unless you really research it, you don't know when these albums were recorded, when these songs were recorded. And if I remember correctly, this is not an accurate picture of the band when this was recorded. This is just a picture that they took of one version of Flatt and Scruggs in their band when they released that particular album. Okay, so strictly speaking, what is bluegrass? Okay, now so you've got Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys with a style of music that he has created and he plays. Nobody else is really playing that. Stanley Brothers start copying lots of, their music and doing their own versions. and they started becoming kind of popular. And then Flatt and Scruggs, two key parts of what created this sound, leave in 1948 before they formed their own band, and they become very popular. So what makes it go from a style to a genre when it's not just being played by one or two bands, but is incorporated by many bands as their sound? Bill Monroe, for years until the mid to late 60s, he was pissed off about this. People were ripping him off, he felt like. So strictly speaking, what is bluegrass? Strictly speaking, bluegrass is an acoustic music played with precision. Usually they play slightly ahead of the beat to give it a drive that you would not get in if you played exactly on the beat. They play just slightly ahead of the beat to like a propulsion to push it forward. And it's played with, as we said, acoustic instruments. The guitar, the upright bass, the mandolin, the banjo, the fiddle, and sometimes the dobro. The dobro is permissible. To distinguish themselves, Flatt and Scruggs distinguished themselves from Bill Monroe's band. They didn't use the mandolin nearly as much in their recordings and in their performances. Many times they did not have a mandolist on tour with them, and they instead used a dobro to play that. And so you've got the guitar and the bass. There's no drums, notice. The guitar and the bass basically driving the rhythm, keeping the rhythm, keeping everybody going. They're serving the purpose of the drums. So the guitar is the rhythm instrument. The bass, obviously, is the rhythm instrument. And sometimes the mandolin using a chop. Bill Monroe developed a chop to keep time. When he wasn't doing a solo or anything, you often hear that chop, chop, chop. But that's your rhythm section. And then you have solos, much in the style of jazz ensembles. You have the song is established, melody is established, everybody playing together, and then one instrument, say the mandolin, takes a solo. Usually, they would take a solo. The solo would usually they play a few measures of the melody, and then they'd improvise for a while and come back to the melody to end their. I don't know if they'd always come back to the melody, but they would play their solo. Recreate the melody in the solo, and then they improvise a little bit, and then the next instrument would take its turn. The banjo might take their turn. The fiddle would take their turn, and they would kind of follow this pattern, of playing. Now the guitar didn't take solos in the beginning. There were solo acoustic guitarists, flat picking guitarists would come a little bit later in bluegrass, and it would become a standard part of it. But it wasn't in the early first 10 years or so, I guess you'd say. So bluegrass music, strictly speaking, features a high lonesome sound, high tenor vocals sung as sometimes solo, but often duet, trio, and in the case usually of any gospel numbers, they would do quartets. And it could always vary. Sometimes quartets would sing non-gospel songs and things like that. And up-tempo instrumentation, sometimes what we would call breakdowns and things like that oftentimes featuring the banjo on those breakdowns, things like that. And so that's kind of what bluegrass, strictly speaking, is. Now, how does it transition from style to genre? We've got more people playing it, and then we've got more and more bands being played, but they're still not calling it bluegrass yet. In the Ken Burns video, they attribute the name for the music bluegrass to fans calling out, knowing the bad blood between Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs and Stanley Brothers, calling the music they wanted to hear from the original band, play some of that bluegrass, meaning the Bluegrass Boys. Just play some of those bluegrass songs, meaning they wanted to hear some of the old 1945 to 48 classics that they played with Bill Monroe. That's part of it. The DJs didn't really start it. The other musicians, to distinguish what they were playing, started referring to it as let's do some bluegrass stuff, and that's kind of how it worked. And then the marketers, much of this music was sold mail order. You couldn't necessarily go into your Woolworth store in any city and find these 78s and then 45s. They were hard to find, so you had to oftentimes send off to mail order distributors to buy that sort of stuff. And how did they let them know what the sound is? Well, they would say 5-string banjo music, because the banjo was so popular, you see. And that would be kind of an indication. That would be, a red flag. Hey, this is that stuff I want to hear. And then eventually they started referring to it as bluegrass. So it was not overnight. It was not a concerted effort. It was just kind of evolved into being known as bluegrass. Another part of it would be of what made it become a genre is rock and roll. Now, how did rock and roll do this? Well, Bill Monroe he sold right many records for MCA or for Decca, I guess, originally, and he was with somebody else before, and he left because they signed the Stanley Brothers, and so. And of course, I'll draw a blank right now which one's which. He's much of his stuff's on MCA, which Decca evolved into MCA, I believe. But the rock and roll was taking such a toll on country music, and what Bill was playing was just considered country music, a particular down home, they might say, country music or something. But country music wasn't honky tonk, obviously, which post World War II became the dominant sound, but not the only sound in country music. But it was more that down home, or that old time sound, but it wasn't old time music by any means. It was commercial music. But it got to the point where in Nashville that system was beginning to be established by the late 50s, trying to combat the surge in popularity of rock and roll, and how it was taking away sucking all the money out of music business in other genres. And they had a system, where they had studio musicians. You came in there and you're a singer, you get in there, here's songs you're going to sing, here's the studio musicians that are going to play on this, they'll figure out what sounds right, they'll put it out. They did that one time with Bill Monroe. It was awful. It was awful. And he had enough clout that the powers that be in the record company said, okay, when Monroe comes in to record, you let him put his boys in there to play, let him run things. So basically Bill was given something that, we know all the musicians want: musical autonomy, the ability to put out what they want to put out, create what they want. Bill got that. And he continued, rather than adapting to rock and roll, he went in the other direction. He continued to make the music the way he had. Not say that it was stagnant creatively, he wasn't, but he didn't. The rock and roll and pop did not draw him in to the point of diluting his sound. So his sound stayed intact, and he could develop, vary it from there. And the other thing, besides, so you've got this continuation, You don't have this big shift in that music. And because of that, groups like the Stanley Brothers and some of them were able to do the same thing. Many of these groups were on major labels at this point in the late 50s, early 60s, and that would begin to shift more and more to regional labels as time passed. But the other big thing is the folk music boom. And at first, bluegrass didn't really appeal to the folk music crowd. But through the efforts of Ralph Rensler and Yorkers and folks from Boston and places like that, started getting interested. And at Washington Square, where they used to get together in around Greenwich Village and play on Sunday afternoons, there would not only be old-time musicians and blues players, but there would be folks, one or two bands, Bill Keith being a part of it, some others, Bill Keith out of Boston, playing bluegrass. And so gradually bluegrass became incorporated into the folk music boom. And this is what propelled, this is where Flatt and Scruggs, for instance, found their niche. And you can see it in all the records that came out in the late or early to mid 60s. You'll see them promoted using the word folk in there. And the folk people thought this was authentic mountain music. It was commercial country music that had lost its place, lost its status in the world of commercial country music, which commercial country music at that point was not hitting on much anyway. But see, different points of view, different ways of viewing it. The folkies from the Northeast thought of it as authentic folk music, and they created a new market that play in the college campuses, the coffee houses, places like that. It was Ash Grove in Los Angeles, Gertie's in Greenwich Village and other places like that, and really a lot of us play in the little one-day folk festivals in the college towns like Antioch, Ohio, places like that, and playing the college concerts and things like that. And that's where the money started coming from. And more it became known as bluegrass. Now, I've just told you what it is strictly speaking, bluegrass. But, that it doesn't always hold true. It can't, nothing is exact. Nothing is, there are always exceptions to every rule. And we'll see in my next episode how, there's a contingent of people that think this is the way bluegrass has to be played. This is bluegrass. It's the only thing that's bluegrass. And in some ways they're right. In some ways they're too restrictive. So this is strictly speaking. I'll do another one on generally speaking bluegrass. What is it? So that's it. I hope you weren't bored to death by this. If you're interested in this, keep on the lookout. I'll try to do more of these, maybe fairly regularly. I've gone on a long time. I've bored a bunch of people to death, I know. So if you're interested, please subscribe and click on like. Make any comments below. If I got something wrong, let me know. And I will remind you, be kind to your neighbors, because guess what, folks? We're all neighbors.